September 19th, 1942, Rabaul Harbor, New Britain. Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki's hands trembled slightly as he examined the aircraft before him, an intact Grumman F4F Wildcat bearing the tail number 03B12. The fighter had been recovered nearly intact after an emergency water landing in Simpson Harbor 3 days earlier. The American pilot, Lieutenant James Davidson, had been captured and was now being held for interrogation at Rabaul's military headquarters. "This cannot be their standard design," Ugaki whispered to himself, running his hand along the fighter's fuselage. "No air force would build fighters this way." The Wildcat sat before him on the captured airstrip, its stubby, barrel-shaped body distinctively American in design. Measuring just over 8 meters from nose to tail with wings spanning 11 meters, the fighter appeared almost primitive compared to the sleek Zero fighters that dominated Japanese naval aviation. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What had captured Ugaki's complete attention? What would revolutionize Japanese understanding of American aviation doctrine was what he discovered when he climbed into the cockpit. 6 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns. 3 mounted in each wing, with ammunition boxes containing 400 rounds per gun. The firepower was overwhelming. Over 55 pounds of lead and copper could be unleashed in a single second when all guns fired simultaneously. This fighter, recovered nearly intact during operations near Guadalcanal, would expose a design philosophy so alien to Japanese military thinking that it would take months for analysts to fully comprehend its implications. The mathematics of this discovery would reshape Japanese tactical doctrine and aircraft design priorities for the remainder of the war. Every assumption Japanese pilots held about American capabilities, about the price American engineers were willing to pay for protection and firepower, about the value Allied forces placed on pilot survival, all were systematically demolished by the evidence contained within this single pristine example of America's primary carrier-based fighter. Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most brilliant aviation tacticians, joined Ugaki at the captured Wildcat. The armor plating behind the pilot's seat is nearly 13 millimeters thick, Genda noted, running his hand along the steel plate that protected the American pilot from rear attacks. "Our Zero has no such protection." "And look at this," Ugaki pointed to the self-sealing fuel tanks located in the fighter's fuselage. Unlike Japanese designs that prioritized range and maneuverability, the American engineers had encased their fuel cells in rubber compounds designed to seal bullet holes, preventing fuel leakage and catastrophic fires. They've sacrificed nearly 20% of their potential fuel capacity for these protected tanks. The journey to this revelation had begun 8 months earlier on February 10th, 1942. That morning, as Japanese forces consolidated their control across the Pacific, Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima had led a flight of 6 A-6M0 fighters on a routine patrol north of Rabaul. The patrol encountered no Allied aircraft but returned with troubling observations about a new American fighter they had briefly observed at extreme distance. "It was slower than our Zero," Nakajima reported to his superiors, "but it appeared incredibly sturdy, almost like a flying tank compared to our aircraft." His assessment was dismissed by most senior officers, who remained convinced of the Zero's superiority over all Allied fighters. The Zero's legendary maneuverability, exceptional range, and climbing ability had dominated the skies since the war's opening days. Its outstanding performance came from its extraordinarily light construction. No armor protection, no self-sealing fuel tanks, minimal pilot protection. Japanese engineers had sacrificed protection for performance, creating an aircraft that could outmaneuver any opponent but would disintegrate or burst into flames when struck by enemy fire. This philosophy had proven devastatingly effective during the war's first 6 months, when Allied pilot training and aircraft quality remained limited. But by mid-1942, the tactical picture had begun to change. American pilots were adapting their tactics, avoiding dogfights with the agile Zeros, and instead using their superior diving speed and ruggedness to hit and run. The Wildcat's 650 caliber machine guns could rip a Zero apart with a single well-placed burst, while the Zero's two 20mm cannon and two 7.7mm machine guns required precision shooting to damage the heavily armored American fighter. The shift became undeniable August 24, 1942, when 12 Zeros encountered 8 Wildcats over Guadalcanal. Traditional Japanese tactics called for aggressive turning engagements, using the Zero's superior maneuverability to get behind enemy aircraft. The engagement that followed shocked Japanese commanders. 4 Zeros were shot down while only 1 Wildcat was lost. Something had changed fundamentally in the balance of power. Pilot reports told the same story across every engagement. The American pilots refused to dogfight. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai reported after surviving a near-fatal encounter with Wildcats. They dive through our formations at high speed, fire a single devastating burst, then continue diving away where we cannot follow. If we pursue, they lead us into concentrated anti-aircraft fire from their ships. By September 1942, when Admiral Ugaki examined the captured Wildcat at Rabaul, the Zero's reputation had begun to transform from invincible weapon to vulnerable liability. This captured fighter, with its armor plating, self-sealing tanks, and devastating firepower, would provide the first comprehensive understanding of why American tactics had evolved so effectively. The technical examination lasted 3 weeks. Japanese engineers disassembled and documented every system. Their report, classified most secret and distributed to Japanese naval aviation units, detailed specifications that explained both the Wildcat's limitations and its stunning survivability. The F4F4 specifications revealed an aircraft optimized ruthlessly for pilot protection and firepower. Empty weight of 2,369 kilograms, significantly heavier than the Zero's 1,680 kilograms. Maximum takeoff, weight of 3,600 kilograms. Self-sealing fuel tanks with a capacity of 395 liters, offering just over half the range of the Zero. Top speed of 318 kilometers per hour, notably slower than the Zero's 331 kilometers per hour. 6 50 caliber Browning machine guns with 400 rounds per gun, capable of firing 2,400 rounds per minute combined. Armor protection for the pilot, engine, and critical control systems. Rugged construction with widely separated control cables and hydraulic lines to prevent single hits from disabling multiple systems. The aircraft's design philosophy was particularly revealing. American engineers had accepted significant penalties in range, speed, and agility to create a fighter that could absorb punishment and return its pilot safely to base. The Wildcat's construction prioritized survival over performance in nearly every aspect. The 6 heavy machine guns required substantial wing structure to handle their recoil. The armor plating added weight that reduced climb rate and agility. The self-sealing tanks reduced range significantly while adding complexity and weight. Japanese engineers calculated that the weight devoted to protection and firepower exceeded 450 kilograms per aircraft, nearly 27% of a Zero's entire empty weight. This weight investment translated directly into reduced performance, but dramatically improved survival rates when hit by enemy fire. Combat reports showed that Wildcats routinely returned to their carriers with dozens of bullet holes. Zeros suffering similar damage invariably broke apart, caught fire, or lost control. These numbers told the story of design choices made in 1937 when the United States Navy issued requirements that would define the Wildcat's entire existence. Fighter aircraft must provide maximum possible protection for the pilot. The specifications began. Fuel systems must incorporate self-sealing technology to minimize fire hazards. Armament must be sufficient to ensure destruction of enemy aircraft with minimum firing time. Requirements reflected American naval strategy in the late 1930s. Unlike Japan, with its limited industrial capacity and trained pilot pool, America could produce aircraft and train pilots in enormous numbers. American doctrine valued pilot survival above all else. A damaged aircraft could be replaced far more easily than an experienced pilot. The Navy needed fighters that could absorb damage, deliver overwhelming firepower, and return their pilots safely to base regardless of performance penalties. The contrast with Japanese doctrine could not have been more stark. The Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm had prioritized performance at all costs. The requirements for the A6M0 specified exceptional range, unmatched maneuverability, and speed, with no mention of pilot protection. Japanese naval strategy assumed that evasion through superior performance would provide adequate protection. They assumed that pilots who couldn't evade enemy fire didn't deserve to survive. They assumed that trained pilots were expendable assets rather than precious resources to be preserved. This single philosophical difference would ultimately determine the air war's outcome. As Admiral Ugaki studied the captured Wildcat, he began to understand the fundamental miscalculation Japan had made. "We designed our fighters to win battles," he reportedly told Commander Genda. "The Americans designed theirs to win wars." The man most responsible for the Wildcat's development was Leroy Grumman, whose company had been founded in 1929 specifically to build naval aircraft. Grumman had studied engineering at Cornell University before serving as a naval aviator and engineer. He understood intimately that naval aviation imposed unique requirements. Carrier operations demanded aircraft that could survive rough landings, operate in corrosive salt environments, and absorb battle damage while returning pilots safely. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Grumman assembled a team at the company's Bethpage, New York facilities to tackle these challenges. They analyzed every aspect of fighter design, calculating weight budgets that prioritized protection and firepower over raw performance. They studied combat reports from European air battles, identifying where protection systems made the difference between pilot survival and death. They experimented with new armor materials and self-sealing tank technologies that might offer maximum protection with minimal weight penalties. The mathematics were brutally simple. To achieve adequate protection, the aircraft needed substantial armor and self-sealing tanks. To deliver killing power against increasingly armored enemy aircraft, the fighter needed multiple heavy machine guns. These requirements added significant weight, which reduced performance across all parameters: speed, climb rate, turn, radius, and range. Grumman made the decision that would define the Wildcat throughout its service life. Protection and firepower would take precedence over performance. The fuel tanks would be fully protected with self-sealing compounds. The pilot would have nearly 13 millimeters of armor plate behind his seat. Control systems would be widely separated and duplicated where possible. The 650 caliber machine guns would provide overwhelming firepower, ensuring that even brief firing opportunities could prove fatal to enemy aircraft. The decision was not made without controversy. Naval aviators who tested early prototypes complained about the aircraft's limited performance compared to land-based fighters. But Grumman and the Navy held firm. Carrier fighters operated under different constraints than land-based aircraft. The ability to absorb damage and return to the carrier was non-negotiable. The first F4F3 prototype flew in 1940, incorporating all these protection features. The F4F4, with folding wings for improved carrier storage, entered service in 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor. By December 1941, approximately 160 Wildcats were in service with the United States Navy, forming the backbone of American carrier-based fighter power. These aircraft would provide the thin margin of survival during the war's desperate early months when Japanese forces swept across the Pacific. The Wildcats' combat debut at Wake Island and during the early carrier battles demonstrated the wisdom of Grumman's design priorities. When facing overwhelming opposition, when operating from damaged carriers or remote island bases, when fighting against superior numbers, the Wildcats' protection and firepower kept American pilots alive and fighting. Its rugged construction allowed it to absorb punishment that would have destroyed any Japanese fighter. Its 6 machine guns could destroy any Japanese aircraft with a steerage, single, well-aimed burst. But these advantages depended entirely on how the aircraft was employed tactically. The Wildcat could never beat a Zero in a traditional turning dogfight. It lacked the maneuverability and climb rate to compete in such engagements. Its survival and success required new tactics that played to its strengths while avoiding its weaknesses. Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch recognized this reality immediately after encountering Zeros in early 1942. Thatch had been studying combat reports from Pearl Harbor onward, noting with growing concern the Zero's overwhelming performance advantage. His response was to develop the Thach weave, a defensive tactic where 2 fighters or 2 pairs of fighters flew parallel courses. When a Zero pursued one Wildcat, the fighter would turn toward his partner, bringing the pursuing Zero under fire from the partnered Wildcat. The tactic transformed the Wildcat's weaknesses into strengths. Its superior ruggedness meant it could withstand brief exposure to Zero fire during the maneuver. Its devastating battery of 650 caliber machine guns meant it needed only momentary firing opportunities to destroy pursuing Zeros. Most importantly, the tactic leveraged the American emphasis on teamwork and coordination rather than individual pilot skill, which had been the hallmark of Japanese training. Admiral Ugaki recognized the implications immediately as he studied the Wildcat. Their entire design philosophy assumes they will be hit, he explained to his staff officers gathered around the captured fighter. They expect to absorb damage and survive. Our aircraft are designed with the assumption that superior performance will prevent hits entirely. This fundamental difference in philosophy extended beyond aircraft design into pilot training and replacement. Japanese pilot training emphasized extended programs lasting 2 to 3 years, producing exceptional individual aviators, but in very limited numbers. American training had been compressed to months, producing less skilled individual pilots, but in overwhelming numbers. By mid-1942, the Japanese Naval Air Arm had no effective pilot replacement system in place, while American training programs were producing hundreds of new pilots each month. Commander Genda summarized the strategic implications with brutal clarity. We are designed to win every battle but ultimately lose the war. They are designed to lose battles but inevitably win the war. Their mathematical advantage becomes more pronounced with each engagement. The technical analysis of the captured Wildcat led to immediate recommendations for Japanese fighter development. The Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden, Thunderbolt, and Kawanishi N-1, KJ Shiden Violet Lightning programs were accelerated, with new emphasis placed on pilot protection and increased firepower. Both aircraft would eventually incorporate armor protection and self-sealing tanks, though neither would match the Wildcat's comprehensive approach to survivability. But these improvements came too late. By the time the Raiden and Shiden entered service in 1943 and 1944, American fighters had advanced far beyond the Wildcat. The Grumman F4F Hellcat and Vought F4U Corsair incorporated every lesson learned from Wildcat operations while adding substantially improved performance. The fundamental American emphasis on protection and firepower remained unchanged, but new technology and manufacturing techniques allowed these priorities to be achieved without the performance penalties the Wildcat had accepted. Admiral Ugaki's report on the captured Wildcat was distributed throughout the Japanese Naval Air Arm in October 1942. Its impact on operational commanders was profound but too late to affect the war's trajectory. Japanese pilot training could not be fundamentally restructured mid-war. Japanese aircraft in production could not be redesigned to incorporate comprehensive protection systems. Japanese industrial capacity could not match American production regardless of design philosophy. The Wildcat's vulnerability became its most paradoxical strength. American pilots knew their aircraft could absorb punishment that would destroy a Zero. This knowledge allowed tactical innovations that would have been suicidal in more delicate aircraft. Wildcats routinely executed head-on attacks against Zeros, absorbing hits that damaged their rugged airframes while delivering devastating fire from their .650 caliber machine guns that completely destroyed their more fragile opponents. The capture of the Wildcat at Rabaul represented a pivotal moment when Japanese naval commanders began to grasp the full implications of their strategic miscalculations. Yet understanding came too late to alter the war's trajectory. By November 1942, the naval battles around Guadalcanal had demonstrated conclusively that American industrial might, combined with design philosophy prioritizing pilot survival, had created an insurmountable advantage. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, visited Rabaul in December 1942 to assess the deteriorating air situation personally. His conversations with Admiral Ugaki revealed a growing sense of doom among senior officers who understood mathematics and production realities. The Americans build fighters to bring their pilots home, Fuchida wrote in his private journal. We build fighters that leave our pilots in the ocean. Given enough time, only one nation will have experienced pilots remaining. This stark assessment proved prophetic. By early 1943, the Japanese Naval Air Force had lost most of its pre-war trained pilots. The survivors, men like Saburo Sakai, Tetsuzo Iwamoto, and Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, achieved incredible individual success, with some claiming over 80 aerial victories. But these exceptional aviators represented a diminishing resource that Japan could not replace. For every Japanese ace, hundreds of ordinary pilots perished in aircraft that offered no protection against American firepower. The human dimension of this technological disparity became increasingly apparent. Lieutenant Tadashi Minobe, one of the few Zero pilots to survive more than 20 combat missions, later described the psychological toll of flying an unprotected aircraft. We knew that a single bullet in the wrong place meant death. Not injury, not a damaged aircraft. Death. The knowledge changed how we fought, made us hesitant when aggression was needed. American pilots flew with confidence, born of knowing their aircraft could bring them home despite damage. This psychological advantage compounded the technological superiority. American pilots, even rookies with minimal training, entered combat knowing their Wildcats could absorb punishment. They attacked aggressively, pressing engagements that might have seemed foolhardy in more vulnerable aircraft. The heavy armament meant even inexperienced pilots could score kills if they managed to bring their guns to bear for just a moment. Japanese pilots, meanwhile, grew increasingly defensive, knowing that even minor damage could prove fatal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, received Ugaki's report on the captured Wildcat in late October 1942. His response revealed the depth of Japan's strategic predicament. This information would have been invaluable in 1940. In 1942, it merely confirms what we already know. We have chosen a path that cannot lead to victory. Yamamoto had famously warned Japanese leadership before the war that he could guarantee success for only 6 months. After that, he predicted Japan's material disadvantages would become decisive. The Wildcat's capture provided technological confirmation of his strategic assessment. Japan's initial advantage had been squandered, and the fundamental asymmetry in industrial capacity and design philosophy was asserting itself with mathematical certainty. The Japanese response to these revelations came in 2 forms: aircraft development and tactical adaptation. Neither proved sufficient to reverse the deteriorating situation. In aircraft development, the Navy pushed forward with the J-2M Raiden, designed specifically to intercept American B-29 bombers. The Raiden incorporated some protective features inspired by the Wildcat analysis, including pilot armor and self-sealing tanks. But production difficulties limited its impact, with only 476 aircraft completed by war's end. The N-1KJ Shiden, another response to the Wildcat's lessons, featured improved pilot protection and 4 20mm cannons, giving it firepower approaching American standards. Pilots who flew the Shiden praised its combat capabilities, but production began too late to affect the wars. Outcome: only 1,435 were built, compared to over 12,000 Hellcats and more than 12,000 Corsairs on the American side. Tactical adaptation proved equally insufficient. Japanese instructors began teaching new defensive maneuvers to counter American tactics. Pilots were instructed to avoid turning engagements with newer American fighters like the Hellcat and Corsair, which had closed the maneuverability gap while maintaining the Wildcat's protection and firepower advantages. These adaptations came too late for a pilot corps already decimated by combat losses. The ultimate validation of American design philosophy came in the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, derisively nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots. In this engagement, American carrier-based fighters shot down over 300 Japanese aircraft while losing only 30 of their own. The lopsided victory demonstrated how complete American industrial and design advantages had overtaken Japanese aviation. What made the Turkey Shoot especially significant was that most American pilots involved were relatively inexperienced, flying against the remaining Japanese veterans. The protection and firepower built into American fighters had effectively neutralized the skill advantage of surviving Japanese pilots. A rookie in a Hellcat or Corsair could defeat a veteran in a Zero through superior technology and the confidence it provided. Commander David McCampbell, who would become America's highest-scoring ace, exemplified this advantage during the battle. On June 19th, 1944, he shot down 7 Japanese aircraft in a single engagement. His after-action report highlighted how American design philosophy had transformed air combat. The ruggedness of our fighters allowed us to press attacks that would have been suicidal in earlier aircraft. We could absorb hits that would have destroyed any Japanese fighter, while our superior firepower meant even brief firing opportunities proved decisive. Back at Rabaul, the captured Wildcat had been moved to a reinforced bunker to protect it from increasingly frequent American bombing raids. Admiral Ugaki visited it one final time in February 1943 before being reassigned. Standing before the fighter that had revealed so much about American strategy and values, he reportedly remarked to his staff, "This aircraft represents not just a different design philosophy, but a different conception of war itself. The Americans build machines to preserve their men. We sacrifice our men to preserve our conception of honor. Only one approach is sustainable." The human cost of Japan's design philosophy became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. By 1944, desperate measures like the kamikaze reflected the logical endpoint of a military culture that valued sacrifice over survival. Having built an air force around aircraft that offered pilots no protection, the step to deliberate suicide attacks was smaller than it might have been in a force that prioritized bringing aircrews home. This contrast extended beyond fighter design into broader cultural values. Lieutenant James Davidson, the captured Wildcat pilot, survived the war in Japanese prison camps. In his post-war memoir, he reflected on the conversation he had with his Japanese interrogators at Rabaul. "They couldn't understand why our aircraft were so heavily armored, why we wasted so much weight on protection. I couldn't understand why theirs weren't." This fundamental difference in how we valued pilot lives reflected everything about why our nations fought so differently. American investment in pilot survival paid compounding dividends as the war progressed. Pilots who survived their first combat tour became instructors, passing their experience to new trainees. By 1944, American training incorporated actual combat, lessons learned in the Pacific, creating a cycle of improvement that Japanese forces could not match. Their training programs remained theoretical, taught by instructors with limited or no combat experience, as few veterans survived to teach others. The mathematical certainty of this approach became apparent in the cold statistics of pilot survival. By mid-1944, American fighter pilots had approximately a 70% chance of surviving a 25-mission combat tour. Japanese pilots facing equivalent combat exposure had less than a 20% survival probability. These numbers represented not just technical differences, but fundamental philosophical choices about how the two nations valued human life. This valuation extended beyond aircraft design into medical evacuation, survival equipment, and search and rescue operations. American forces invested heavily in air-sea rescue capabilities, deploying specialized aircraft and submarines dedicated to recovering downed aircrews. Japanese forces made minimal efforts to recover downed pilots, considering them essentially lost once they entered the water. The material realities of these different approaches were starkly apparent by 1944. The American carrier fleet operated with full complements of experienced pilots. Japanese carriers increasingly sailed with rookie aircrews, many with less than 100 hours of flight time. The qualitative gap in pilot skill had completely reversed from 1941, when Japanese naval aviators had been among the world's finest. This reversal represented the compounding return on America's investment in pilot survival. The Wildcat's protection features the armor plate, self-sealing tanks, rugged construction, had preserved a cadre of experienced pilots who formed the leadership core of later air groups, equipped with more advanced aircraft. Japanese aviation, having sacrificed protection for performance, had effectively consumed by its own future by losing irreplaceable trained personnel. The tragic irony was that Japanese aircraft designers had recognized this problem before the war. Naval engineer Jiro Horikoshi, who designed the Zero fighter, had argued for incorporating some pilot protection in early prototypes. His recommendations were overruled by naval officers who prioritized performance specifications. After reviewing reports on the captured Wildcat, Horikoshi wrote in his diary, "We designed what we were ordered to design. The Navy demanded performance without protection, and we delivered exactly that. The consequences were inevitable." The consequences indeed proved mathematically inevitable. By 1945, Japanese naval aviation barely existed as an effective fighting force. Trained pilots had been almost completely eliminated through combat attrition. Surviving aircraft lacked fuel and spare parts. The carriers that had once dominated the Pacific lay at the bottom of the ocean, or huddled, in home ports without operational air groups. Meanwhile, the American carrier fleet had grown to unprecedented size, with over 100 carriers of all types operating in the Pacific. Their air groups were fully staffed with well-trained pilots flying advanced aircraft that maintained the Wildcat's emphasis on protection and firepower while closing performance gaps. The technological and philosophical seeds planted in the Wildcat's design had blossomed into overwhelming aerial dominance. Perhaps the most poignant testament to this transformation came from Commander Minoru Genda, who had helped plan the Pearl Harbor attack. Visiting the captured Wildcat one final time before Rabaul was abandoned, he reportedly said to Admiral Ugaki, "We destroyed their battleships at Pearl Harbor, but they destroyed something far more precious, our entire conception of aerial warfare. This fighter, with its armor and guns, told us everything we needed to know about American intentions. They planned for a long war where pilot survival mattered more than immediate victory. We planned for a short war where sacrifice would bring quick success. Only one of us was right." The legacy of these different design philosophies extended far beyond World War II. Post-war fighter design universally adopted the American emphasis on pilot protection and survival. Even Soviet and Chinese aircraft incorporated armor and self-sealing tanks as standard features. The Japanese lesson, that unprotected aircraft eventually meant untrained pilots, had been learned at tremendous cost. For the men who flew these different aircraft, the design philosophies represented existential realities. American pilot Eugene Valencia, who survived multiple combat tours to become an ace with 23 victories, later reflected, "The Wildcat wasn't the best fighter in any performance category. It wasn't the fastest, couldn't climb the highest, couldn't turn the tightest. But it brought us home when we were hit. That mattered more than anything else." Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, one of the few Zero pilots to survive the entire war despite being wounded severely in combat, offered a contrasting perspective. "Our Zero was a wonderful fighter when undamaged, but we flew knowing any hit could be fatal. American pilots flew knowing they would likely survive even significant damage. That difference changes everything about how you approach combat." The human dimension of these technical differences became increasingly clear as the war progressed. Lieutenant Commander John Thash, who developed the Thash weave tactic that neutralized the Zero's maneuverability advantage, summarized it succinctly. "The most sophisticated fighter in the world is useless without trained pilots to fly it. By building fighters that sacrificed some performance for protection, we ensured our pilots survived to become veterans. The Japanese built magnificent flying machines that killed their own pilots almost as efficiently as we did." This lesson was not lost on post-war military planners. American fighter design continued to emphasize pilot protection even as performance capabilities increased through technological advances. The philosophy that produced the armored, heavily armed Wildcat evolved into the design approach that created every successful American fighter since World War II. The mathematical certainty of valuing trained personnel over performance specifications became enshrined in procurement requirements. For Admiral Ugaki, the captured Wildcat represented a turning point in his understanding of the Pacific War. His diary entries shifted from confidence to growing concern after his examination of the American fighter. By early 1943, he had concluded that Japan could not win a protracted conflict against an industrial power that valued pilot survival so highly. This realization did not prevent him from continuing to fight. He ultimately died leading a kamikaze attack on August 15, 1945, the war's final day. The contrast between Ugaki's death, flying an unprotected aircraft on a suicide mission, and the American approach of bringing pilots home whenever possible, encapsulated the fundamental difference between the two nations' approaches to warfare. Japan had built an air force willing to sacrifice everything for momentary advantage. America had built one designed to survive, learn, improve, and eventually dominate through accumulated experience. The mathematics of industrial production reinforced this philosophical difference. America produced over 300,000 aircraft during World War II, including nearly 40,000 fighters for naval use alone. Japan produced approximately 76,000 aircraft total, with fighter production limited to around 30,000 of all types. American industry could replace lost aircraft within hours. Japanese factories struggled to maintain minimum operational strength, but the truly irreplaceable resource was trained pilots. By protecting their aviators through aircraft design, America preserved the human capital that ultimately proved decisive. Each surviving pilot represented not just a combatant saved, but future pilots properly trained, tactics improved, and combat effectiveness enhanced. The compounding value of experience proved mathematically insurmountable for Japanese forces that consumed their veteran pilots in unprotected aircraft. As the Pacific War drew to its conclusion in August 1945, the lesson of the Wildcat had been absorbed at tremendous cost. The fighter that Admiral Ugaki had examined so carefully at Rabaul represented far more than a captured enemy aircraft. It embodied a fundamentally different conception of warfare, one that valued human capital above performance specifications, that recognized trained personnel as the truly irreplaceable resource, that built machines to preserve men, rather than sacrificing men to honor machines. The final testimony to this difference came from an unexpected source. Masatake Okumiya, who served as a staff officer analyzing aerial combat reports throughout the war, wrote in his post-war memoir, "The Zero was possibly the world's finest fighter in 1941, yet we lost the air war completely. The Americans built fighters to preserve their pilots. We built fighters that consumed ours. Given enough time, their approach guaranteed victory as certainly as mathematics itself." In this observation lay the ultimate truth about the Wildcat and what it represented. America had not merely built a fighter. It had built a system that valued human life and experience as the critical resource of modern warfare. Japan had built magnificent machines that ultimately destroyed their most precious asset, their trained pilots. The captured Wildcat at Rabaul had revealed this truth to Admiral Ugaki and his staff, but the revelation came too late to change the war's inevitable conclusion. The story of the Wildcat and the Zero represents more than a technical comparison of World War II fighters. It illuminates how deeply held values become embedded in technology and strategy, how different conceptions of human worth manifest in machinery and tactics. The Wildcat's 650 caliber machine guns and armor plating weren't merely technical specifications. They were physical expressions of a nation's commitment to bringing its sons home alive whenever possible. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.